talk about suffering and evil, when we've been talking about happiness and love and all these good things, why go from the positive to the negative? Because abortion, euthanasia, assisted suicide, cloning, destructive embryonic stem cell research, discrimination against the disabled, against the poor, the homeless, these things don't happen in a vacuum. These things usually happen because people are suffering and they don't know how to confront or deal with their suffering. They don't understand their suffering. They don't know what to make of it. They don't know the purpose of it, and so they begin to despair. And so we come up with human solutions to problems that are really beneath the dignity of the human person, but to us they look at first to be very good solutions. Abortion, euthanasia, all these things are really attempts to solve human suffering. And all they do is compound and compound the human suffering because people still don't understand why they suffer. In our Catholic Christian faith tradition, we have such a rich understanding and a rich theology of human suffering and of evil, of understanding it, of making sense of it, and of bringing it to redemption. And it is incumbent upon us to teach this theology, or what we call theodicy, the study of human suffering, of why human beings suffering, why God allows it. And so in this session, I'm going to spend about half an hour talking about human suffering, how to understand it, and give you some methodologies. Certainly not an exhaustive methodology. There are whole volumes of books over hundreds of years that have been written on this subject. And so you have a whole wealth of resources available to you. There are video series and television programs and YouTube videos that you can watch and download. And there's just a lot of resources for you. But I've brought to you kind of a synopsis of what I think has been the most helpful in our movement in talking with young people and older people and using examples and stories that very quickly in very short amounts of time can help people to get a better understanding of suffering and evil, why God allows it, and how to make use of it in their lives, and how not to be so afraid of it, how to turn our suffering into moments of real good. Now, just as you probably expect, just as there are 4 interpretations or 4 different levels of happiness, there are also 4 different ways that we can interpret or understand our human suffering. And I've put the Greek words for them because the Greeks were very good at distinguishing. We're very poor at it. We have one word for happiness, happiness level 1, happiness 2, happiness 3, happiness 4. And the Greeks had 4 different words. They have 4 different words for suffering. The first is the Epicurean view of suffering. This view comes out of the level 1 view, that the meaning of life is physical pleasure and possessions. And so if you have to suffer pain or deprivation, life begins to lose its meaning. So the Epicurean view is to amass as much physical pleasure and possessions as you can, and if you have to suffer or lose something, just compensate with some other pleasure. And to the extent that you can continue to compensate, you had a bad day, go out and go on a shopping spree, eat some chocolate or whatever, watch TV, watch a sports game. To the extent that you can continue to compensate, then you'll feel better. Of course, the problem with that is it's very shallow. It doesn't really leave you feeling better. It doesn't answer any of the deep questions that the human soul asks about why do I suffer? And what's the purpose of this? And why does God allow me to suffer? The second view of suffering is called the Stoic view. This view, as the word might suggest, is where somebody sees that suffering is useful if it can make me stronger. If in some way I can gain more power or more control or become more independent, or because I have suffered much in my life, I can write a book and go on TV and talk about it and people admire me. I become popular and respected because of the suffering that I had. Then I can have a sense of meaning in my suffering. Of course, the minute that people stop caring about my suffering, then my suffering becomes meaningless to me. The moment it doesn't make me more independent, the moment it starts to make me more vulnerable or more weak or less popular in people's eyes, I begin to question the meaning of my life, and I can be thrown into despair. And the third view of suffering is called the Orphic view. The Orphic view is the view that suffering can have purpose if I can do some good with it beyond myself or someone else. And so there starts to be some sort of a redemptive aspect to suffering, that I can use my suffering for good. If by my suffering I can bring about greater justice, if people can recognize greater justice because of what I've suffered, or see an injustice for the first time and want to do something about it, then my suffering had meaning. Or if through my suffering I bring greater love to you or more compassion to you, then that suffering has meaning. This could be a father who works hard for his family and suffers and sacrifices a great deal to give and provide to his family what they need. He doesn't get the sleep he needs. He doesn't get to buy the things he wants. He doesn't get to go to the fancy places he would like because he's working hard to support his family with the things the family needs. That kind of suffering can have great meaning if you see that your family is growing and thriving, that you're making a difference to people. You can get meaning out of your suffering in the Orphic view if in some way your suffering has brought about greater beauty in the world. Mozart worked so hard from his deathbed on that, that last wonderful requiem, and he suffers so much through it, but he sees that great beauty is being brought into the world because of how hard he's worked. Or a famous artist who maybe has worked so hard and created some great work of beauty for the world, the suffering was worth it. The problem with the Orphic view, of course, is when we stop seeing a good that can come out of it, we can end up in despair. I didn't bring the actual photograph. You can see it online because it's very disturbing to a lot of people. But there's that very famous photograph of a child in Africa. It was taken many years ago, several decades ago, by a famous photojournalist. And it's the picture of the young black African boy who is starving to death with an extended belly, and he is crawling on the ground. You just see him in the picture, and you can tell off picture that there is the food, there's rice being distributed. No one will help this boy. And he's trying to crawl on the ground towards the food, and right behind the boy, approaching the boy, is a group of vultures, because his death is imminent. And the photojournalist took this picture, and it was published, and the journalist could not see any good in this suffering. And because he couldn't see any good in it and no redemptive purpose in it, he despaired and he ended up committing suicide. That's an example of what happens even with the Orphic view of human suffering. If we can't see that our suffering is bringing about some greater good, we can despair. And so then there's the Christian view of suffering, which is infused with agape, that there is love, unconditional love under all suffering, and that human beings have a choice that we can make. We can choose to see the good in our suffering and bring about greater good beyond ourselves. We can choose to embrace the suffering and work towards greater peace or greater patience or greater faith in God. Or we can choose to become cynical and to despair and become depressed in our suffering. We can choose to be self-focused in our suffering and to mourn what we have lost. Or we can choose to be other-focused in our suffering and recognize that even if I don't see a good coming out of my suffering, I trust that in some way God can perfect this suffering and bring about a greater good, and I don't need to see it. I trust in the Christian view that God will not waste one iota of human suffering, and that all of it will be redeemed, and that all human suffering will be purified, and that in the end, if we choose it, because we don't have to choose it, if we choose it, God can bring that suffering into joy, and our joy may be complete. In the Christian view, there is no eternal suffering, other than suffering by choice, or eternal suffering by choice, which would be hell, right? But if we allow God in, no suffering is forever. All suffering can be redeemed and ended, and there is a point where we can be returned to eternal joy. And so I want to go through that Christian view of suffering to answer this very important question. We call it theodicy, the study of this question. Why would an all-powerful, all-loving God allow suffering and evil in the world? Because if he were all-powerful, he could prevent suffering, and if he were all-loving, he would, wouldn't he? The inability to accurately answer this question drives more people away from faith in God than anything else. Either because they cannot understand suffering in their own life, or because they cannot understand suffering in someone else's life, or because they cannot understand abstract suffering that they read about in the news or see in a photograph. So it's essential that we answer this question, because if we don't help people to understand this question, we fail in our Respect Life ministries. If people don't understand this question, the answer to this question, they will do desperate things. Even aborting a child they know is an intrinsically valuable human person that they have a duty to protect. Even terminating their own life when they know against their better judgment and instinct that it's wrong to do that. Even approving of therapies and technologies that we know are bad for us, are evil, are intrinsically disordered, and yet we use them because we think there's no better alternative to avoid suffering. So we have to answer this question. We usually save it to the end in our teaching when we're teaching in a high school, for example, because we want to wait until the student is matured enough to really see more of this suffering, and we want to answer the questions first of what is happiness and what is real love and what are the principles that come from that before you can give a really good solid answer to this question. But it's essential not to leave it out. So here are 3 of the biggest reasons why people will turn away from faith in their suffering. God cannot help me. God does not love me. God is not there. And we sometimes illustrate this with a story that Father Spitzer calls the story of people with no elbows. You may have heard a variation of this story, and it's very useful. It's a little story. It's very useful. It's about how God creates a whole bunch of people, and he sets them in front of a banquet table. And he tells them to eat, and then they don't see him, but they're hungry, and they can't see God. So the people try to eat, and you can see them, they're trying to eat, but there's something wrong with them. God has apparently neglected to create them with elbows. And so every time they try to get the food to their mouths, their arms won't bend, and they end up just making a big mess. Right? They try throwing the food up in the air, and it just comes down on them, and they try and go behind their backs, and they can't do it. And so these people divide themselves into 3 different groups. The first group of people says, wait a minute, God must be very stupid, because if he were all-knowing, as people say he is, then he would have known that we need elbows in order to eat. And if he were all-powerful, he would have been able to create them. But he didn't. So obviously God is not all-knowing or not all-powerful or both, because here we are suffering. We're going to starve to death. So these people grew depressed in their inability to answer the question of why they were suffering. And in their depression, they starved to death. The second group of people thought about that for a minute, and they said, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Because God, if he were powerful, he would have to be all-powerful. And if he were all-powerful, well, what's the most positive power that exists among us as human beings? What is it? The most positive power among human beings is love. So if God were all-powerful, he would have to be all-loving, right? But we're suffering and dying. And so obviously the answer to the question is not that God is not all-knowing and all-powerful. He knew what we needed, and he could create it. But he neglected to create us with elbows on purpose, because he is not all-loving. He doesn't care. And he probably thinks it's funny. And he's watching us right now, entertaining himself and enjoying this until he's bored, and then he'll do away with us. And these people grew worse than depressed. They despaired at the thought of once they died, having to live all eternity with this angry, hateful, vengeful God who played with their lives under their suffering. So these people began to kill each other in imitation of their God. The third group of people said, well, wait a minute, let's reason this through. That doesn't make any sense either, because you just said that if God existed, he would have to be all-loving. But God obviously is not. And so, he's evil and angry and causing all of this to happen. And so, if we desire love, and love is the most positive power that exists among us as human beings, and God doesn't have that as a part of his nature, then he can't be God. So the real answer to the question of our suffering is that God simply does not exist. For if he did exist, he would be all-powerful, he would be all-loving, and he is not. So we have something that God does not have, which makes us more powerful than he is. The real answer to the problem is that God simply does not exist. And these people, in their despair and their cynicism about life, began to kill themselves. Well, there was this fourth group of people, and they weren't arguing or starving to death or killing each other, because they had stopped thinking about themselves long enough to notice the need in the eye of the other across the table. And in noticing that, they were moved to empathy. They could feel the pain of the other. And when they were moved to experience empathy, they desired to be compassionate. And the compassion drove them to seek love. And they moved their elbowless arms across the table, picked up the food from each other's plates, and began to feed each other. And it was, you guys are like, I knew that. I knew that's how it would end. It was in this that those people discovered the meaning and purpose of our human suffering. That God didn't create us imperfect beings so that he could control us. He created us beautiful beings, but he allows our world to be imperfect so that we can be moved to love. I want to work through that a little bit with you and give you some tools of how you can help people with that. The first thing I think we need to do is dispel some false myths that people have about who God is. So before we talk about who God is and how we can understand him as a loving God and see him as a loving God and have faith in him as a loving God, we have to dispel the myths of who God is not. So first of all, God is not the payback God. The payback God is this false myth we sometimes have about God, that God saw something wicked I did and has been waiting, lo, these many years to pay me back for it. Now's his chance, right? And he's going to get you. God wouldn't do that. Why? How do we know that God would not do that? Because if God's nature, if he really is God, he has to be all loving, right? And if God's nature is love, love does not seek to pay you back for a past grievance. Love would not do that. Love can forgive because love has no ego. Love sees the good of you before and above the good of itself. And so if God truly is God, he would love you unconditionally, which means he would want your good and he would not hold grievances against you. Right? Secondly, the Stoic God. This is the image of God as this Greek God up there who's playing your life like a chess piece and doesn't care about you. And again, we know that this is a false myth about God, because if God is all loving, he doesn't take pleasure in our suffering. That would be the opposite of love. So God has nothing to gain by our suffering, because he has no ego. At least not the way that I'm using the word ego, right? He has no inflated ego that he's better than you and he's bigger than you, and that's what he thrives off of, is being better than you, his creatures. That would be contradictory to the nature of love. The third is the punishing God. That God really is looking for the wrongs that you do so that he can punish you, because he loves to mete out punishments. You see it all over the place in the Old Testament. That must be who God is. This was an Old Testament view of God. Right? And God sent Jesus to correct that, because God is not the punishing God. Think about how we even view this in our own lives with you as a father or a mother, right? Or maybe a sibling. When your child does something wrong, are you so glad because now you can punish, and you've been wanting to try out this new punishment on your child all this time? He finally did something wrong. No, that would be cruel, evil, wicked, and disgusting. Right? Well, God is not like that. God isn't looking to punish you for your sins. The greatest punishments we have from our sins are the sin itself. In fact, most women who have had abortions, when they're being honest, will tell you, you don't need to punish a woman who has had an abortion. And most pro-lifers, in fact, I don't know any real pro-lifers who think that a woman should be punished if abortion is illegal, because those women will tell you that the abortion itself was the worst punishment, that they are a second victim to abortion. So God is not looking to punish us. The fourth one is this vision of the cheerleader God. This is the sense that God is my co-pilot, right? God is my best buddy. God is my best friend. And he's sitting right there by my side, and he's cheering me on. You know, go, Camille, go, you're doing great. I'm so proud of you. Oh, and then when something goes wrong, he kind of switches teams. You know, okay, go, Sally, go. You know, he's not going to do that. God is not just your cheerleader. You're his child. He is your father, and he infinitely loves you. And he is intimately connected to your life. So much so that he died for you. God is not just your cheerleader who can cheer you on but can't do anything to help you when you fail or when you suffer or when you fall. He actually suffers with us. How do I know that? Jesus Christ is the embodiment of that. Right? He suffered what we suffer. And he suffered more than we suffered when he died on a cross for us. He was complete innocence who gave his life on a cross for us and suffered an excruciatingly painful death, but gave it all over for our good. So God is not this cheerleader. He is incapable of helping us. He knows our suffering. He understands our suffering, and he suffers with us. And then, of course, there's this view of the Greek God. Again, the God who has control over us, but is trying to play our lives. I switched the Stoic God with the Greek God. The Greek God is the God who wants to make fun and have fun with your life. The Stoic God is the God who wants to make you stronger in your suffering. The God who sees you suffering and thinks this is good for you because it's going to make you stronger, it's going to make you more powerful, so I'm going to make you suffer. God is not like that. God will take your suffering from you when he can, unless he sees that in some way it's going to violate someone's freedom, your own, someone else's. If in some way it's going to bring less love into the world. He will always allow suffering as long as he sees that you have still freedom over that you are still capable of making a choice in that. In every moment of suffering, you can know that you are still capable of making a choice for good, for bringing love out of that suffering. Now, how can we really help people in a mental way? Because some people are mental people and some people are people of the heart, so we want to use both. How can we help people in a mental way come to that understanding of God as all love and dispel some of these myths? There's this little mental experiment that Father Spitzer has laid out in some of his books, which you can use with people. It starts out, what is the greatest power that exists among us as human beings? And most people would say love. If it is love, then can God, who is perfect, in order to be God in the first place, be without love? And remember, if he's not perfect, if he's without love, he's not perfect, so he's not God. His old definition of God is unconditional, infinite, perfect, absolute ultimacy itself. So if love is the greatest power we have as human beings, can God, who is perfect, be devoid of love? No, that would be contradictory. It would be impossible. So if what you really want is to be unconditionally loved, if that's your deepest desire, would it be possible that God could not fulfill that desire? No, because once again, he would not be perfect. He would not be unconditional. He would not be unconditioned. He would have a limit to his love. So if you desire to be loved unconditionally, God must be capable of loving you unconditionally. And if God would be able to love you unconditionally, but you obviously cannot get to God by yourself because you are finite and he is infinite, does it make sense that God would want to come to you? Does it make sense that he would not stand on one end of the infinite chasm with you at the other end and say, if you really want my love, come to me? No, because he knows you cannot ever cross that infinite chasm. You are finite, and he knows you cannot do it, and it would be cruel for God to do that. So would God be willing to come to us? Of course he would. Just logically, philosophically looking at the mental experiment, of course he would want to come to you. And that is the Christian explanation of who God is as Emmanuel. That God loves you so much he would take on human form and come to be with you and suffer with you in order to cross that infinite boundary between you and him, to shorten that gap so that you can walk to redemption. Now, there's lots of beautiful stories of the heart that we can tell. There are also some scripture verses. A lot of you know this one, 1 Corinthians 13. Some of us have this, stitched as embroidery or, on a window plaque or something. But we all know this. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not boast. This becomes a very, very beautiful way for us to think about or reflect about God's infinite love, is by using this, 1 Corinthians 13, as an exercise. So we can meditate as a meditative exercise. And this could be an exercise or an experiment you can give to your young people that you work with, or with the elderly people you work with in a hospice, or the women that you are working with in a pregnancy home. Have them look at this from 1 Corinthians 13 and say, here's who God is. This is God's revelation of who he is. Because everywhere, if God is love, everywhere you see the word love, you can replace that with the word God. And if God is infinite, everywhere you see the descriptive term, you can precede it with some term of ultimacy, like perfectly, absolutely, unconditionally, infinitely. Okay? And so you reflect on this, and you do it slowly. God is infinitely patient. He's not sitting there in the confessional, hearing you say this sin one more time after 10 years of doing it and saying, for God's sake, will you stop doing that sin? I'm tired and sick and tired of this. God doesn't do that. God is infinitely patient with us because he understands our human nature. And he will wait our entire lives if that's how long it takes for us to come to him. There's lots of stories about it. Remember the story in scriptures about the man the wealthy man who owns the fields, and he hires field workers throughout the day. And then in the last hour, he hires more field workers who are standing around and couldn't find any work all day. And at the end of the day, he pays everybody the same amount. Right? He'll wait the whole day for you to come to him if that's how long it takes, and pay us the same amount. And of course, the people who came first thought they were going to get more, and they say, wait a minute, why don't we get more than that? And he says, I gave you what I promised you. Why can I not do with my generosity whatever I want? God will wait as long as it takes for us to come to him. He is infinitely patient. God is absolutely kind. And you think about that, how this dispels the myth that God is stoic, angry, punishing. That's not kind. God is infinitely kind. And by kind, we don't mean nice. God's a nice guy, and he looks nice, and he's happy, and he pats you on the back. But he's not really kind. He's not going to go out of his way to be generous and loving and good to you. No, God is kind, which means he is generous and good to you. He wants good things for you. God absolutely does not envy. He's not envious of things that you have, right? And he wants to take them away. He's an envious God that he doesn't want you to put them in place of him. Because why? Not because his envy means that his ego is big, but because he knows that you replacing him with other things will make you unhappy. It is in that sense that God is not envious. He doesn't despise you for the things you get to have. He just does not want you to put them in the place of him because he is what will truly fulfill you. Here's a beautiful thought, something that we can meditate on or reflect on that helps us to see the heart of God, is the names that God gives to himself. Remember when we talked about with St. John of the Beloved, how in biblical times, people, when they would name themselves, it defined the essence of who they were. It wasn't just like calling somebody Susie because we like the name. You would actually define yourselves by the name. So whenever you see God giving himself a name, it's defining his essence of who he is. And one of the first words we see in Scripture of God is Yahweh. And Yahweh, of course, has this meaning of all-powerful master of the entire universe. I am who am, right? I am God, all being, all power, master, creator of the entire universe. And then we see a second revelation of who God is through another name that God gives himself, Emmanuel. The angel announces his name shall be Emmanuel. And what does Emmanuel mean? God with us. So this is telling us something deeper about God's nature. All-powerful, master, creator of the entire universe wants to be with us. Not standing apart from us at a distance where we're not allowed to say his name even or look at him, but he wants to be with us in our midst, in our heart. Live inside of us. He wants to be part of our world and part of us. And then Jesus grows up and gives us another name for God. What is it? Abba. What does Abba mean? A little bit deeper than father. I heard someone say it's more like daddy. Kind of more like daddy, because it's a very affectionate, endearing term that a little child would give to his father in the ancient biblical times. You would hear Abba, Abba, Abba. It's like saying Dada, Dada, Dada. And it has this connotation that I trust you, and I know you love me, and I know you want what's good for me, and there's nothing that I can do that will make you not love me. Right? That's this notion of who God is. And of course, this is so offensive to some of the scribes and Pharisees that they tear their garments when they hear this. You know, God is the untouchable. He is distant from us. He is separate from us. We are all unclean in our sin. And you're going to call him Abba? You're going to say Dada? That's what you're calling God, Dada? Are you kidding me? And Jesus says, no, I'm not kidding. That's who your God is. He is unconditional love. And we see some beautiful images of that in Jesus' storytelling. One of them is the story of the prodigal son. I'm going to go through this story just a little bit because sometimes we don't quite get the translation in our first century or in our 21st century interpretation of this story. We hear our 21st century needs in the story, and we're not listening the way the first century Jewish people heard this story. Now remember, how is Jesus telling the story? What's the setup for it? He's talking to the scribes and Pharisees, and he's answering their accusation against him that he cannot be from God because he is spending time talking to, eating with, going into the homes of the prostitutes and the tax collectors, right? And so you can't be from God because if you were, you would know that these people are unclean and you would not be spending this time with them. And Jesus answers them with this story to say, you have a false notion of who God is, and we need to dispel that myth. So he tells this story about how there's this wealthy father, and he has two sons. Now, everywhere you see the wealthy father, that father represents God. That's who God is. So what he does, Jesus is telling you this is who your father is and this is how he acts. And the two sons he has represent us in the story. And so he has these two sons. The youngest son one day comes to the father and he says, Father, give me my share of the inheritance and I will be on my way. Now, first century Jewish tradition, who gets the inheritance? The first son. The second son has no claim to any of the inheritance. So this is a person without any claim at all. And he comes to the father and demands his share. The impudence of this boy. You have no share. You have no right to any of this. But not just that. What does he say? Give me my share of the inheritance now. When do you get your inheritance usually? When your father has died. So what is he saying? Translation, Dad, you are as good as dead to me. I don't care about you. I don't care about this family. I don't care about anything you've taught me. All I care about is your stuff, your money. So please give me what I want and I'll get out of here and leave you alone. That boy has just committed the ultimate offense against his family. He's just ultimately disgraced his father. There is no worse crime or sin that the boy can commit in the eyes of his family than to call his father as good as dead, to claim what is not even his, and then to leave. To forever wipe the dust of his feet from his feet of the family that has fed and clothed and loved him all these years. But what does the Father do? Father is the respecter of our freedom. He's not a punishing God. Right? He's not a stoic God. He's not an angry God. He's not a cheerleader God. God is a loving God. He is a just God, but he is a loving God. And so he respects the boy's freedom and he gives him half of the inheritance. Does he grieve? Does he probably beg the boy to reconsider and to stay? Probably, you would imagine he would. But in the end, he gives the boy a share and the boy goes off. Now, where does the boy go? The boy goes to spend the money where? Down the street? No, where? To a foreign land. And not just any foreign land. What does Jesus tell us it was? It was a Gentile land, right? The unclean people, the people who were not elect, not saved, right? The people who were not Jew. He went to a Gentile foreign land and he spends all that money there. Now what has he done? He's just taken money that was necessary for the health of his own economy in his own country, and he has spent that great amount of wealth. Remember, his father was a wealthy man, and spent that great amount of money in a foreign land, a land of the unclean who are not even Jews. He has just committed the ultimate offense against his country. There couldn't be a worse crime than this that you could do to your own nation, that this boy could have done, than to forsake your nation and your people economically when they relied on the funds of the wealthy men for the poor people to survive, and take it to spend it in another land. And what a slap in the face against his country that it was a Gentile land. So you can see this boy is getting worse and worse and worse in the eyes of the Pharisees, right? But that, as if that were bad enough, right? What does he spend the money on? Right, prostitutes, women, wine, food, gluttony, violating every prescription of the Torah. So now what has he done? He's committed the ultimate offense against God, his religion, the Torah. Right? So now this boy is dirt, right? He's like dog meat to the Pharisees and the scribes because he has ultimately offended his family, his country, and his God, his religion, the three pillars of Jewish culture. But it gets even worse. The boy discovers that there is a famine raging in the land, and he has spent all of his money, has nothing left. And that famine is indicative of this famine that is happening in the boy's soul, right? The emptiness and the loss of what he has given up. So there's this famine in the land, and the boy, all he can do to get anything to eat is to go work for a pig farmer, and he has to herd the pigs. And he longs to fill his belly, Jesus says, with the food that the pigs are eating, but no one would even give him any of that. Now, if you know anything about first century Jewish tradition, pigs are really, really, really unclean, right? So now this boy is not just an ultimate offender by his sin, he is now ritually impure by living with and touching the pigs and even longing to eat the food the pigs are giving, but he's so disgraced and so disgusting, nobody will even give him any of that. So the pigs are seen as a higher level of status than he is. So what happens now? In the pig pen, the boy comes to his senses. This tells us in our deepest and darkest moments of agony and suffering and even sin, we can make a choice. We can make a choice. We can choose to despair in our suffering, in our sin, in the evil that we've been part of or the suffering we are part of, and end up dying in our misery, or we can choose to bring redemption out of our suffering by trusting in our Father. And that's what this boy does. And this is the critical part of the story. The most heroic thing that occurs in this story is the boy at that moment realizing that his father loves him and that his father's love is true. And in that moment, he picks himself up out of the pig pen and he says, "My father's servants have more to eat than I do. I will go home to him and I will tell him, 'Father, I no longer deserve to be called your son. Just treat me as one of your servants and I will serve you all of my days.'" Now in the Catholic faith, we call this imperfect contrition, right? Perfect contrition would have been, "Father, I love you and you love me and I have offended you against your love. Please forgive me because I have hurt you." But he doesn't do that. He has imperfect contrition. "Father, I'm starving to death. Help. Get me out of this pig pen. I trust you." In our faith, that is good enough. Imperfect contrition is enough to save you from hell. Help, God. I trust you, God. Get me out of this pig pen, God. That is enough for God to reach out and grab you. That's all he needs. Because he is your loving Father. He will move you to perfect contrition later. That will come. Because nothing unclean shall enter heaven. But there is time for that. All he needs is for you to make the choice. And he will grab you. If we don't believe that, we believe in nothing of the message of Jesus Christ. And all of Scriptures becomes meaningless. And our faith is dead. But if we do believe that, watch what happens. The boy gets up and he starts to walk home. Now the story changes. Now you see the perspective from who? The Father. We get to see what the Father has been doing. And the story says, very beautifully, the Father sees the Son coming from a long way off. It's the first thing we see from the Father's perspective. What does this indicate that the Father has been doing, lo, these many years while the boy has been gone? Looking for the boy. Not hating his boy, writing his name out of the family book, refusing to acknowledge him, cursing him anytime a stranger comes to the land visiting and says, "Hey, I just saw that son of yours in the land of the Gentiles that I had to pass through. Do you know what he was doing?" No, the Father was not cursing his boy or disinheriting his boy blotting his boy's name out. He was looking for his boy because he longed for his boy through all of the suffering and through all of the sin. God longs for you. He is like the hound of heaven, right? Who seeks you, searches for you. And he sees the boy coming from a long way off. And what does he do? Does the father sit there and say, here he comes. Let him come. No. The Father will not wait for you to come to him. It is too hard for you. Once you make that choice, the Father will zoom into your heart and he will embrace you and he will love you. And that's what this father does. He runs out to the boy and then he throws his arms around that boy and he kisses him and he puts the ring on him. Now, wait a minute. First century Jewish tradition, this boy is really, really, really unclean. What happens to you if you touch someone with pigness all over him? You get pigness all over you, and you have to go through the same 7 years of ritual cleansing that the boy would have to go through. Not this father, because this father is unconditional love. And in his pure love, he can wipe out the pigness of the boy. He saves the boy in that embrace. And the symbolism is beautiful. He says, quick, get a cloak and put it on his back. Why? The cloak is richness, right? It's symbolic of royalty. So this boy, I'm elevating to the level of royalty. Quick, get sandals and put them on his feet. Why? Because God is not just concerned with your transcendental nature. He's also concerned with your material nature. His feet are hurting. His feet are cold. His feet are calloused. Give him something for his feet. Right? Quick, get the family ring and put it on his finger. First century Jewish people did not wear rings for cosmetic purposes like we do today. They wore rings to symbolize you are in this family. It would have a little symbol on it that would signify the family ring. And so what he's saying is you are back in this family instantly, 100%. You were the one who left the family. I never wrote you out of the book. The minute you come back to this family, we embrace you, and you are right back in this family. God does not write us out of his book, ever. We write ourselves out of his book, which is what we as Catholics believe hell is. Hell is the absence of God's love freely chosen by the recipient. It is not God removing his love from you. He would never do that. His love is still there. But we enter hell when we freely choose the absence of his love for whatever reason. Why would we do that? When this story beckons us to his call, to his heart. And now what happens? The story should end here, shouldn't it? We have just seen Jesus' consummate revelation of who the Father is, his unconditional love, his unconditional forgiveness, his unconditional mercy. But what does it do? It keeps going. What happens? He goes in, the Father kills a fatted calf, they have a party for him. Out in the fields is the second son. This is the boy who has done everything right. He has followed all the rules, he has followed all the laws, he has worked very hard his whole life to do what his father has told him to do. And he hears music coming from the house. Who do you think this second son is? Yes, it is sometimes us. What is Jesus doing with this part of the story? Why didn't he end it where it climaxed? Where it should have climaxed, it should have been the ending. Because Jesus is so clever, he's written the scribes and the Pharisees into their own story. Right? What do they say? You can't be from God because you are spending time with the sinners and they are unclean, which means you are unclean. And Jesus says, wait a minute, here's the second boy. The second boy who is kind of like you guys, right? The second boy has done well. He's followed the law. He's followed the rules. He's kept the commandments. That's very good. That is commendable. But this boy lacks something important, love. He lacks love. So the boy hears the music, and he's wondering what it is. So he calls a servant over to him. Now, imagine if you had to be this servant, right? How you would feel at this point. He says to the servant, what is this music? And the servant says, well, so you know that younger brother of yours, the one that basically called your father as good as dead, took his share of the inheritance, which was really not his share, it was your share, and then he went to the land of the Gentiles, the unclean people, and he spent all this money and violated your country and was a criminal against your country, and then violated the Torah left and right by eating, drinking and gluttony and women and sex and prostitutes, and then ended up living with the pigs. He was really unclean. Well, he's back. And your father ran out to meet him and hugged him and gave him a cloak and sandals and is having a party for him. Right? Can you imagine? Can you relate to this older boy? How would you feel? How would you feel? How dare you? How dare you? I have spent all these years serving you, and I haven't even so much asked for a goat to share with my friends, and you give this boy the fatted calf? Really? Are you kidding me? Come into the family, says the father. What? Come into the family. Yeah, this dirt rat brother of mine goes out, sins, calls us all good as dead, disinherits all of us, let alone we don't even disinherit him, which I told you to do, and you didn't do it, and now he's back, and you accepted him back in. I'm not going in there. Forget it. And what does Jesus do? does he say, you ingrateful son, you self-righteous, how dare you? I am the Father and I will do with my wealth. No, he does not. He gets on his knees and he begs his son to come into the house. Even those that Jesus reserves the harshest words for, those who are self-righteous, who will not allow God to fulfill his nature by cutting him off from unconditional love. Even them, God, even us, when we do this, God will get on his knees and beg us to come into the house. Yes, he will do more than get on his knees and beg you. He will stretch out his arms and die on a cross for you. That's the story of who God is. That's why you can trust him. Because Jesus tells us that this is who he is. And this is how we act. Like Peter, right? In this beautiful painting, right? This is such, it looks like this is, I know I have a priest friend of mine, Father Gerard Segudo, who calls this the broccoli Peter. Looks like he's being forced to eat broccoli, right? He does not like this, right? This is the Last Supper, if you can't see it, where Jesus is washing the feet of all the disciples, and you can kind of see this guy up at the very top who's like, oh, I can't believe he's doing this. You just revealed you are the Son of God, and you're washing our feet. This is symbolic because in first century Jewish tradition, you couldn't even force a slave unless it was a foreign slave to wash people's feet. It was that degrading to wash someone's feet. Why? Well, because the foot was considered the worst part of the body, and people would walk around in the streets barefooted with sandals, and they'd walk in cow dung and donkey dung. They didn't have cars, so the feet were pretty bad, and they would get infected a lot and stuff. So you couldn't force people to do this. Jesus is choosing. The Son of God is choosing to wash your feet. And Peter won't do it at first. He says, no, Lord, you will never wash my feet. He still has this Old Testament view, and Jesus is trying to move them to the new wineskins, right? The new revelation of who he is. He does it gently. You will never wash my feet, God. You are God. He's still kind of in this. And Jesus says, Peter, if I don't wash your feet, you can't ever get into heaven. Why is he saying that? You can have no part in my kingdom. Why does he say that? Because my kingdom is all about unconditional love. And if you don't let me unconditionally love you, you can't get in, because that's what it is. So let me love you. Click. Peter goes, oh. Got it. Okay, got it. And then he says, not just my feet, Lord, but my head and my hands as well, right? Peter gets very excited a lot in the scriptures when he gets it. And Jesus says, Peter, that's okay. I just need your feet. This is symbolic. You don't have to take a whole bath right here. And so Peter sits there, and I love this, where she's just like, okay, all right, I know, I trust you. I don't like this, but I trust you. And he does it, okay? All right, let's answer this question of suffering. Moral suffering. Why does God allow suffering? Now that we understand who God is, why does God allow suffering in the world? Well, there's two different kinds of suffering. There's moral suffering and there's physical suffering. Moral suffering is the kind of suffering that comes into the world because of a choice that we make for evil. When you do something evil, suffering will come into the world in some format. Well, broken relationships, people get hurt. Right? Well, there's a little syllogism for love and suffering that I want to share with you. A syllogism is when you start with a basic premise, and then you move to another premise that comes from the first one, and then that leads you to another premise and another until you get to a logical conclusion. So we're going to start with the basic premise that we've already formed, talked about, and given good evidence for, that God is love. Right? God is love. So if God is love and he creates you in his image, what does he want for you? He wants you to know love. Right? He wants you to participate in and know love as he knows love. So if God is love and he creates you in his image, and his purpose for you is for you to know love and participate in love, what does God have to create as a part of your nature in order for you to participate in love? If love is a choice, if love is the desire, acting on the desire to do the good for the other, whereby doing the good for the other is just as easy, if not easier, than doing the good for myself, what does God have to build into your nature in order for you to activate that? Freedom. God has to build free will, choice, the ability to make a decision, a choice into your nature. So if God builds free will into your nature, in order to activate free will, what does he have to set before you? Choices. Deuteronomy, I set before thee life and death. Of course, he advises us, choose life then, so that you and your descendants may live, but he doesn't force it, right? So God sets before us choices. When God sets before us choices, what is his role in the choice? Advisor, sure. Encourager, sure. Inspirer, sure. Beckoner, sure. The hound of heaven, sure. But what ultimately is his role in my choice? God is a respecter of my freedom. He will respect my freedom. He will allow me to make that choice. Because some people will say this, okay, I follow you all along the syllogism to here. But if God really loved us, then why doesn't he smash all the evil people right before they're just about to do something evil to me? Why didn't he stop that guy right before he knocked me on the head with the baseball bat, or right before he said that nasty thing in front of all my friends? Why didn't he stay? If he really loved me, he would have stopped that person from making that choice. Okay, well, if God was going to stop people every time they were about to do something evil, how many of us would still be here today? Right, that's the answer I get in every audience, doesn't matter who. Not only that, but if you knew that God was going to smash you if you were going to do something evil, what would be motivating your choice for love? Fear. You would not be motivated out of a desire to do the good for the other above the good for yourself. You would be motivated by your own selfish desire not to get smashed. And that's the opposite of love. You cannot know love that way. So God will respect your choice so that we are moved to love out of compassion and empathy and the desire for the good of the other, not out of my own selfish desire to stay alive. And if God respects our freedom and we choose evil, what comes into the world? Suffering, right? Suffering comes into the world because of the choices that we make, because God gives us freedom, because he wants us to know love, because we are made in his image. But God is not just the conclusion to a syllogism. God isn't this cold ending to a logical premise, right? God can actually take the suffering that comes out of our own actions, our own evil actions, and he can redeem them if we choose the moment that he offers redemption. Let me give you an example. Do you remember this picture? This photograph was taken during the dropping of the napalm bomb in the Vietnam War in the 1970s. This little village in Vietnam, and this Colonel John Plummer ordered the dropping of the napalm bomb, and you can see now the American soldiers are herding out the children who are just terror-stricken, traumatized. Their families, who knows where they are, the parents may be dead by now. This little girl in the middle has literally had her clothes blown off of her, or burned off of her by the napalm, and she is screaming in agony, and we look at this and we think, how can God allow this? If he loved us, how can he allow this? About 30 years later, this little girl grew up, and she began speaking all around the world to people about love, about peace, and about forgiveness. In one of her lectures, she didn't know that sitting in the audience was John Plummer, the colonel who had ordered the dropping of the napalm bomb. And after her talk, he was moved to tears, and he went to her and he told her who he was. And she could only say two words over and over again to him. Do you know what they were? I forgive. I forgive. And they had this picture taken. And this became a beautiful symbol of the redemptive purpose of our suffering. That through our suffering we can come to know greater love and build greater peace and form bonding friendships. And we can come to know one another, people who at one point would have been enemies, who come together and reconcile, and through that reconciliation can know God's love even more deeply than they ever did before. What about physical suffering? The suffering that doesn't come from the choices we make, but just because the way the world is, right? The world is fallible, and we get old, we fall, we trip, we stumble, we get food poisoning. The evil that comes into the world not from somebody else's malicious actions, but just because of the fallen physical nature of the world. Why does God allow this kind of suffering? Well, first of all, that kind of physical corruption came into the world by the choice of human beings, by the fall of Adam and Eve. And that's when we learn through Scripture that darkness came into the world, and our bodies became corrupt, right? And God had created a Garden of Eden, and it is through our sin that the darkness, the weakening of the will, and the physical suffering of the human body came into being. So we know that this is not something that God wants for us or plans for us, but God can use this for good. If you think about it, what is the one thing that most often we need in order to get us out of our own egos? Sometimes we need to partake in helping and assisting with the physical sufferings of others. That's what it takes. We need the weakness of one another to move us out of our own selfishness into the domain of empathy, like those people with no elbows. Sometimes it takes looking at the neediness of another human being to move me out of my own selfish nature and into the domain of love. And God knew that. He knew that once we had tasted putting ourselves above God, as Adam and Eve did when they sinned, that we would need the physical defects of the world to drive us back to compassion, to drive us back to love. So these things are just meant to help you understand The meaning and purpose of human suffering. Again, there are a lot of other resources available to you that will give you a much deeper theology and philosophy of human suffering and answer that question of theodicy. But these are some elements that I think you can use in a lot of your ministries and a lot of the work that you do.